So this Amy Harmon person contacted me several times asking to do an interview. Unlike Sargon, I'm not a fucking idiot, so I just told her to go choke on shit. I knew she wouldn't give me a fair take, and looking at the title of this article right there, White Supremacists, I was right. And then in there something about how them drinking milk means they're ignorant of genetics or something. It's really stupid. Pulitzer Prize winning levels of stupid going on right here. Read it at your own risk. White people have higher rates of adult lactose tolerance. There was some article talking about how eating dairy is a form of white privilege. So some guys made a joke about this and went around drinking milk in public political rallies or whatever as a symbol of white pride. And it's just kind of a joke, and it spread as a little meme from there. But Amy Harmon, who's supposed to be some expert on right-wing hate, is so stilted and one-dimensional in her thinking that it goes right over her head and she thinks it's deadly serious. And you read this article and it's all over the place. White supremacists, white supremacists, white supremacists. Nobody besides fucking wignats like Chris Cantwell or Richard Spencer calls themselves white supremacists. That term is a smear. It's not a neutral descriptive term. And so when someone says white supremacists all throughout the article, you know this is shit. Now, let me just skip ahead and show you that this is approximately what race realists think the IQs are of major racial groups, focusing primarily within the United States. And these differences are about 80% a function of genetic differences or about 80% heritable, according to what I think about this. Now, other race realists or people interested in human biodiversity, they'll have different numbers and there's a spectrum of debate. So agree, disagree, arguing for this is beyond the scope of this video. I'm just saying this is what the position is. But when Amy Harmon smears this conclusion as white supremacist, it is nonsense on a level that illustrates that Amy Harmon is knowingly lying or just doesn't bother to even do the basic research before writing any of these kinds of hit jobs. Now, going on to the position itself, just consider the basic impossibility of what Amy Harmon and her cherry-picked experts that she pulls quotes from, what they believe. Their belief is that all of the races, or clines, or populations, or whatever term you want to use, have precisely identical genetic potential in all cognitive functions. From verbal ability, to pattern recognition, to visual spatial ability, to mathematical ability, all populations are 100% the same in their genetic potential for those things. Exactly the same in terms of genetic potential. That's what they believe. Now, nobody believes that there is equality in genetic potential in these things between individuals. Some people are just innately better at math, and some people have to work harder to understand the same concepts. They're placed in the same environments, they have the same exposure to mathematical concepts, and some just learn faster than others and don't have to work as hard. People get that. That has been studied, that has been quantified by intelligence researchers. However, as soon as we get to the population level, then they must be exactly the same. That even though individuals can differ, and say an individual black person could be genetically more predisposed to higher intelligence than an individual white person, the average for these populations must be 100% exactly the same. Now, if you think I'm strawmanning these people, I am not. I've dealt with these people for over a decade. This is what they believe. I'm simply presenting it up front in a way where its stupidity is glaring. I'm presenting an absurd proposition that they have in a nutshell when it's not meant to be presented in a nutshell. The ultimate craziness of what they're saying is meant to be eased into you in stages. Look at all the extensively documented racial and subracial differences in hair, in skin, which is the largest organ in the body, by the way, in bones, in muscle types and distribution, racial differences in where fat is stored, racial differences in organ sizes. And guess what? Virtually all modern studies on race and brain size and brain morphology show differences there as well, meaning that not only are the total sizes of the brains between the races different, but the relative lobe sizes also differ. You could say, for example, oh look, Africans in the United States have physically smaller brains. This means that their brains are going to be more efficient. Perhaps Africans are innately smarter than Europeans, or maybe they have faster processing speed, or maybe this or maybe that. Who knows what the differences will be? Who knows what differences in cognitive abilities will come from having a smaller brain? Maybe it's more compact, maybe the neurons are closer together. There's all sorts of stuff that could be. But you wouldn't look at that and go, oh, well, despite that, they're going to be 100% exactly the same. That is a belief that you are meant to take on faith. Make no mistake, faith that there are no inherent racial differences in anything that the brain does. The debate here, at heart, is about evolution. We can look at differences in fertility between populations in the US and IQ. In general, yes, lower IQ people have been having more kids, but for black people, this trend is even stronger. So let's say that blacks are 100% equal at a genetic level in terms of potential for intelligence as whites. We'll just treat intelligence as a singular thing for the sake of argument here. Well, since at least the 1950s, and in all probability well before that, more dumb blacks have been having kids than dumb whites. So if they're equal today, then they must have been smarter than whites in the 1950s, at least in terms of their genetic potential for being smart. Or if they were equal in the 1950s, well, then they must be dumber today in terms of their genetic potential. You cannot have both because there was a differential fertility here. Nature doesn't do equal. It would be a cosmic joke of a coincidence if all these groups ended up the same in the brain. And wouldn't it be just so convenient if that were the case? Because you have all these New York Times types going on and on about how bad racial inequality is and how all races must be made equal. It's like a holy writ. And of all the possible outcomes, black people smarter by this much or this much, white people being smarter by this much or this much, we're supposed to take as a starting position that they landed on equal, and any deviation from this is literally Hitler. I would have infinitely more respect for the Harmon crew here if they just came out and said that they thought that black people were genetically smarter than white people, because then they would at least be operating in the world of possible outcomes. They wouldn't have this faith-based ideological dictum that they must be the same. They would be saying, well, I think they're smarter. Why do you think they are? Smaller brains, more compact neurons. Maybe look at sports performance and say, aha, see, their sports performance is evidence of at least better kinesthetic abilities, which may then transfer into other cognitive functions, right? You could do something there. There's an argument to be made there that blacks are smarter than whites. I think it's wrong. I would argue against that. I have a very different conclusion, but at least if you're making that argument, you're dealing with something that could possibly be true, right? You're not dealing with the kind of cult belief. You're dealing with something that has some sort of connection to reality, even if it's kind of tenuous and even if it's a really rough hypothesis. And I'm sure people in here are going to want me to respond to more specific things said in this article, but what the hell do you want me to respond to? Like, here's a quote from the article. Some scientists suggest that engaging with racists would simply lend credibility to obviously specious claims. Yes, the obviously specious claim that evolution did not stop at the neck. How specious. Many say that they do not study race in any case. The racial categories used in the United States Census correlate only imperfectly with the geographic ancestry groupings of interest to evolutionary geneticists. Black, for instance, is a socially defined term that includes many Americans who have a majority of European ancestry. Okay, well, this is wrong. Here's genetic cluster data. Socially identified black clusters in the black cluster 98% of the time. If you use more than 100 markers for a categorization, you're going to get even more accurate results, and this also works with random SNPs. We've done this to death. I've gone over this ad nauseum previously, but what Harmon's gambit boils down to is just an authority jam down. Harmon finds the experts to say what she wants and then weaves that into the narrative. There's no argument made in this little quote. There's no arguments being made in anything said in this article. It's just a geneticist says, well, black is a totally constructed category and doesn't refer to real genetic groupings. There's not any data presented there to show that. It's just proclaimed to be and sort of treated as if it's like some sort of default starting point argument. The problem with this authority jam down argument is that if you apply evolutionary thinking to humans, you will be blackballed if you're in an academic setting. For example, James Watson, when he just mentioned in passing that Africa would probably remain poor due to their genetic potentials, he was kicked out from his own institute. And of course, academics are trying to retcon James Watson as not having ever been a very good scientist or whatever in order to justify their blackballing of him. You can also look at Bruce Lawn, who studied population differences in microcephalin, and he decided to stop the research because he was told that if he didn't stop, his career would be in danger. Or Richard Lynn, whose degree from Ulster University was revoked because he said some things that they thought were racist at Ulster University. Not wrong, but racist. And don't take it from me on this. Here's how Wikipedia describes it. Quote, in February 2018, the Ulster University Students' Union. Students' Union? What the hell does a students' union have anything to do with Anyway, Students' Union issued a motion calling for the university to revoke Lin's title as emeritus professor. The motion argued that Lin's title should be revoked because he had made statements that are racist and sexist in nature. The university agreed to this request in April 2018. Notice, not incorrect statements, but statements that were racist and sexist in nature. And while not about race, another example would be Lawrence Summers at Harvard, who was fired for saying that men and women might not have as much variability in intelligence, i.e. women will have fewer dumbbells and Nobels than men, whereas men will be more extreme. You'll have more really stupid men, but also more really smart men, resulting in the intellectual elite in any society being disproportionately male. And this thing that Lawrence Summers said, this is not even a hypothetical thing. This is not even a hypothesis. This is a well-established fact. And he got fired for this. He got fired for saying something that is just a fact, that is just true. Any standardized test, you always see this. You always see more variability in the male population, in the female population. It's a rule. But the point is that experts who point to human differences get fired. Or you can look at the case of Drushton. He had what was once the most commonly used intro to psychology textbook in Canadian universities that was just pulled from use. So you get blackballed. So when Harmon pushes the academic elite angle here with the Harmon crew, she's dealing with a politically filtered population because the experts that publicly don't agree with the virtually impossible position of absolute race equality, they get fired or otherwise marginalized. And it's very telling that this is the only way that Harmon knows how to push this narrative, is through the authority jam down. But even in this Stasi environment that you have in universities in the US, anonymous surveys of intelligence researchers, biologists, physical anthropologists, they recognize biological race and recognize that some proportion of the intelligence differences between the races are a function of genetic differences or are heritable. Consensus on that centers around 50%, but I think it's 80%. And I say in a video called Why 80%, why I think this is. So my position is a little bit of an outlier here compared to expert consensus on the heritability of race differences in intelligence. So, okay, fair enough. Argue against me on that video if you think 80% is too high. I make a case why I think it's 80%. I'm a little bit more extreme, I guess, but I'm not completely off base. But guess what? Harmon's position is 0, and her position is more of an outlier than mine. I'm actually closer to the mainstream view on this than you are, Harmon. What's more, I don't lie to people and claim to be right in the center of the mainstream. Right? You're over here, you're at 0, and you're telling them that you're the mainstream. I'm here at 80%, and I'm telling them I'm not exactly in the mainstream. The mainstream's at 50%, I'm in 80%, but I'm not lying to them and telling them that I'm right in the middle. And surveys repeatedly show that there is far more support for the existence of biological races and the heritability of those differences than the public faces of those fields ever want to admit. Now, these charts here, these are flying by here in the video, and you can press pause or read the relevant article to see more on that. Read the charts at your own rate, and also find the links to the original sources within that article that's linked in the video description. I'm not linking to the original studies in the video description here. However, the article does link to those original studies. Now, I shouldn't have to bring any of this up because we should just be able to argue the argument and move on and shouldn't be appealing to authority. You know, appealing to authority is a fallacy, right? Blah, blah, blah. But I know that people listen to experts, so I have to point out that the experts who talk openly, they're the ones who are politically filtered, which is why you need anonymous surveys to figure out what the experts actually think as opposed to relying on the politically filtered people that like to talk to the press, and that the press likes to talk to. Keep that in mind. That Amy Harmon is going to seek out people with credentials with a certain point of view on any topic. Basically, about 1/3 of relevant experts in the West, 2/3 of relevant experts in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, and basically 100% of the relevant experts in China have views on the existence of biological races and the heritability of race differences in what we call intelligence that would be described as race realist. Though I'm pretty sure that's not a term they use in China, probably not even in the former Soviet Union. Harmon banks on authority jam-down tactics to push a narrative that is dumb as pig shit. It's Pulitzer Prize-winningly stupid, impossibly stupid. Then, to anyone who doesn't believe it, she calls a white supremacist. If you think Asians, Indians, and Jews have higher IQs than Amerindians and Polynesians, you're a white supremacist, according to Harmon. And as a cherry on top, the Harmon crew here goes on about ye old scientific races from the 1800s. And what's hilarious about this is that in the New York Times itself, they had an article showing that Stephen Jay Gould just shit out the mouth lied about Samuel George Morton. Morton had a collection of skulls from around the world, and he ordered them by size and found that size differences between the races. Stephen Jay Gould, in Mismeasure of Man, claimed Morton got the data wrong, and Gould then quote-unquote corrected this data. And he corrected this data mathematically. Gould didn't go himself remeasure the skulls. He was able to, with a pen and paper, correct Morton's mismeasurements. And Gould's corrections, guess what? They oh so conveniently showed the races to be absolutely identical. The problem for Gould is that the State University of New York actually had Morton's collection of skulls right there. And in 2011, they decided to finally, let's just measure the skulls. Now, that fact alone is a bit disturbing that it took them this long to actually just measure the skulls, do something that simple. But they did in 2011, and they found that no, Morton's measurements were correct, and Gould was a liar and a slanderer. Done. Morton's measurements were right, Gould knowingly lied. Case closed. There's a few hacks floating around on Twitter that like to do all sorts of mathemagic to vindicate Gould. Buddy, it's a fucking volume measurement. It's not rocket science. There's not a whole lot of room for mathemagic to try to vindicate Gould's corrections of this. No, you measure the skulls, you measure the volume of the skulls, the end, done. Morton was right, Gould lied, case closed. Now, the only reason we know that Gould lied about Morton is because we have Morton's skulls. Everyone else's collections were lost, so there's no way to check those. There's no way to check the claims that Gould made about all these other guys mismeasuring skulls. And beyond this, modern measurements, those including those that use MRIs, they vindicate what Morton and all the old scientific racists, quote unquote, were saying. So what are we to say now? Are anthropologists fudging the numbers up to the 2000s? This unbroken chain of everyone who measures skulls all committing fraud? That's what you'd have to believe what Gould is saying. That's what you'd have to believe to imbibe this old scientific racist narrative, that they were all committing fraud and that this fraud is continuing to this day, and the people working the MRIs are also committing fraud. Or maybe this, how about this? Maybe Gould was a fraud, and there's a bunch of politically motivated anthropologists who are repeating what Gould was saying. Now, peppered throughout Harmon's hit job here are these claims that people who recognize divergent evolution in humans are promoting some sort of race ideology. Now, first off, some are, some aren't. There are some people who are literally just kind of pseudo-autistic people who like to categorize things and know about this stuff, and they're mostly apolitical. Full disclosure, I happen to be one of the race ideologues. Fair enough. I'm not a white nationalist. I call myself a first worldist, and I can describe what that is at a later date. But Harmon is also a race ideologue. And again, the difference is that Harmon lies about her agenda. All this race equality stuff, this mania that they have been trying to make the world flat. What does the denial of divergent evolution result in, politically speaking? Well, it results in a kind of racial nationalistic rage, a rape and revenge narrative that tends to motivate all nationalistic excesses. This belief that we were wronged by the country around us, so we have the right to take revenge upon them. That's where you get the atrocities. The atrocities are always motivated by a sense of revenge against people who have done us wrong. The reality is that when you control for IQ, these race differences in economic outcomes not only go away entirely, but in some cases invert. But you have blacks and Hispanics imagining that the cause of their being poorer than whites is a result of various boogeymen sort of lumped into this notion of white privilege. White privilege, a privilege that nobody wants. You got all these people pretending to be Indian, pretending to be black. Nobody wants this privilege. And the very fact that white privilege is sort of an epithet to be used against whites is a piece of evidence itself that white privilege doesn't exist. Basically, the ubiquity of the concept of white privilege is evidence that white privilege doesn't really exist. It's just one piece. It doesn't seal the deal. If white privilege really did exist, you would not expect to see the concept of white privilege so commonly used. White people are the only racial group in the United States that you can legally discriminate against. In hiring, in college applications, in government services, in loans, in terms of their right to form racially exclusive organizations. Everyone can form racially exclusive organizations except whites. And the justification for all these double standards is the belief in oppression. And if you recognize divergent evolution in humans, then all assumptions of oppression-based differences between these racial groups goes out the window, because now all disparities could be genetics. Genetics is placed back on the table and the whole operation is called into question. Now, Amy, what happens when you have a group of people who are being attacked, who are having their communities destroyed through mass immigration that they have no choice in, where it's illegal for them to defend themselves and their communities from Somali invaders who come in, who are discriminated against on the basis of race on all levels, and then they're told that they have privilege and that they are fundamentally rotten for being white? And if they oppose this stuff, if they try to fight back in whatever way they know can, probably not in the most effective or eloquent way, you smear them as alt-right or reactionary or racist or, in this piece, white supremacist. Fire them. Send your establishment attack forces to beat them up. Unperson them. Deny them any voice. You do all this stuff, Amy. What's left for them? What's left for them? What can they do in this situation to counter your bigotry? How do they get you to stop attacking them? To stop you from trying to destroy them? To stop your hate? They can't speak out against you to any effective degree. All the institutions are closed to them. They go onto the internet, they get banned. They try to talk to the news media. Maybe they'll get something on Breitbart, maybe. But that's been cordoned off from the general mainstream media. They don't have the ability to speak out. What's left for them? What's left, Amy? I'm not going to answer that question here. You'll have to answer that to yourself. Alright, it's time to come back. I'm ready to be back, taking a crack at 2 videos a week now. We'll see if I can keep that up. It'll be a bit different now though. Previously, I had a lot of videos that were massively backed up by a lot of prior data that was gathered over previous years, but that has since been exhausted. My YouTube channel has been, in a sense, a harvesting of prior work that I and Sean have done. I then tried to maintain that level of output with that level of data after the prior data had sort of been harvested, which was of course impossible. I can keep up that sort of post-Kraut pace in terms of number of videos, or I can keep up the level of data per video, but I can't do both. So I had to make a choice. Do I keep up the level of data, or do I keep up the volume output? And I've chosen to keep up the volume output. Of course, I'll always be data driven, but it cannot be at the previous level. It just can't. Now, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider donating to my friend who runs the Patreon page, Cool Tapes. He'll make a cool picture, and it seems like he does it every time I put out a video on this channel, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But just know that each video I make takes between 12 and 20 hours to make, so just keep that in mind when deciding whether or not you want to donate to this guy, Cool Tapes. Take into consideration how long it takes me to make a video when deciding whether or not all you guys want to give him, you know, $500, $600 per picture he makes. So I'm back, and it looks like alt-right is kind of fading away, and I think we now have a chance to start something from the ground up. Something with a proper formalized platform, a clean slate, a new beginning of the first worldist era.